Daily Detroit is brought to you by your Metro Detroit Edward Jones Financial Advisors. To learn how they can help you reach your financial goals, visit edwardjones.com. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
Hey friends, Jer Stays here. Welcome to Monday and welcome to your Daily Detroit for September 12th, 2022. Today, I'm sharing a conversation with Craig Fahle. His voice, if you've been following the Detroit conversation for a while, should sound quite familiar to you. He's a longtime radio host and now communications professional. His newest thing for your ears is the VVK podcast, an occasional show that does deep dives into important and interesting issues. Me and Craig have talked without microphones around a number of times, but this is the first time we've taken it on air. And there's a wide range we cover when it comes to topics. Media today, finding common ground on gun control, mental health, and a bit on the future of the Detroit region. Let's get started. Joining me at the table here at the Grand Hotel, a voice that you probably know if you've followed anything in Detroit over the years, Mr. Craig Fahle. I can't believe this conversation's happening.
Well, we've done this before. This isn't the first time. So it's good to see you, though, Jerry. I'm so excited about some of the things that have changed up here in recent years. And one is that they finally recognize the value of podcasts and podcasters up here. Because when I first broached them about this a few years ago when I was working for Deadline, they're like, well, what is it? What's a podcast? And I said, it's actually a way a whole lot of people get their news and information now. And you should embrace this. And they have, which has allowed a number of us to actually do this up here now, which is great. And because, hey, free podcast love, right? It's great to be here.
Well, and it's a great opportunity to have deeper conversations. I remember all the way back to your WDET days as being one of the few places where you could actually have a real conversation with somebody as opposed to just, here's your 1 minute snippet.
Yeah.
And here's the exact talking point. And the thing is that especially in this political environment, I don't care if you're on the left or the right, trust is built when you actually get to know somebody and understand, why are they doing this policy? What is happening? In a lot of ways, I see the value of the little snippet and whatever. I know that social media, whatever, but those deeper conversations, they resonate with people.
Though, Jared, one of the problems with that, and this is, something that I deal with as a PR person now, which is what the bulk of my job is, although I'm starting a new podcast, but everybody is trained to speak in sound bites. So when you actually get them in a situation where you want them to expand on an idea, it's almost as if it's going against their training, right? Because the message is so important to make sure you control that message and never screw it up, that there's a lot of guests that aren't always that comfortable. They start to squirm a little bit when you get to around 5 minutes. And then it's like, oh, we're going 20? Then they really start to sweat a little bit. And it's not that they can't handle it. It's just they're not used to it. So getting them to sort of open up it's a real skill and it takes time. And to get people off their talking points is always the goal, but it's not easy to do.
No, and it's a challenge to book as well.
Yeah.
It's a real challenge.
I totally agree with that.
People have asked me many times, well, Jer, you could do an hour, 2 hours. I'm like, Lord, no. There's no way every day I could do 2 hours because it's something where, okay, if I got the right guest once a week, possibly.
Yeah.
But every day, if you want to cover all the issues that are happening in an area or a place, you have to be able to handle the breadth of where people are at. And that's why sometimes, if it's boring, it's got to stop.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. My show used to be 2 hours a day at DET, and that was a lot. We had probably 8 or 9 segments every show that we had to book, first of all, and, 10, 15, 20 minutes at a pop. I loved it. It was great, but it's not easy to book that. And again, finding guests who are willing to sit down for that long is really difficult because people are busy.
Well, yeah, and then some topics, people are just afraid to speak on them because this is the biggest small town you'll ever meet. So you'll get information, and you and I both know this. We're talking shop a bit here. You know what's going to happen. An idea of what it is. But to get people to actually talk about it is a whole nother thing with a microphone on.
Sure.
Right? And so getting a clear idea of what's happening can sometimes be difficult because people don't want to engage on that level.
I'm going to push back just a little bit in that I think deep down people do want to engage on that level.
Okay.
And I just think there's fear. There's reluctance, and everything is so politically fraught these days. Part of the reason that I don't necessarily miss doing the talk show on a daily basis is I'm getting older, and it's harder for me to keep up with, all the changes in what terminology, where's the public sentiment on certain things. unintentionally, you can say something stupid without even realizing it until all of a sudden you find yourself being, trashed on Twitter and on, social media. And you're like, what did I do wrong? Oh, you're just a little out of the times. I'm fine and happy to turn some of this stuff over to a younger audience, especially when it comes to the really controversial, hard-hitting issues of the day. I mean, more than happy to talk about it, but at the same time, it is difficult these days to do it in a way that doesn't tick somebody off, even people who like what you do 99% of the time.
Oh, I'm familiar with in my email inbox. This happens.
Exactly.
That leads me to the point I was going to make. What are some of the things that you've seen that have changed over the years? You did DET, you did Deadline. Now you're, in the PR world. You'll be doing more stuff. I mean, can't keep you away from a microphone.
Sometimes it's my own fault, and other times it's somebody else's idea. This time I'm going in willingly. I'm happy about it. What's changed? A ton has changed. I think people are quicker to offend than they used to be. And I'm not the guy that's out there making controversial statements all the time or trying to rile people up. That's never been my style. But like I said, you could be batting 900 with somebody. They agree with you on 9 things out of 10. And that 10th thing that you say something that they don't like, and they're like, I'm never listening to you again. And it's just, I'm sorry, but you can't agree with somebody on everything. And if you do, maybe you should be listening to a different show to get a different perspective. Mm-hmm. Because just having your own viewpoint parroted back to you all the time isn't good for anybody.
Well, and when it comes to the discourse, it worries me that we continue to move further and further into tribalism, where it's not about the policy idea. It's, this guy or gal I follow says this is bad, so I think it's bad.
Yeah.
And so instead of it being, okay, this is what I believe, or these are the things I think would be better, it's, he said it was bad, so therefore I don't like it. I don't even know why.
There's some of that. Independent thought is a difficult thing to come by these days. Think about this. How many people have you interviewed say, well, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, I'm an independent? Bull. You're not an independent. You come down somewhere, but people don't want to think critically about things all the time. And it's not because they don't know how or they don't have the time. I just think that we've gotten to this point where it's so easy to, again, just have your own opinions parroted back to you all the time. And that's comfort food for people. They like to know that they're on somebody's side, that, this person's telling me the truth and the rest of them are all lying. And so we've taken advantage of people's laziness, I guess, in the media by allowing it to get so tribal.
Has social media reinforced us?
Oh, I think so. I mean, and you have the power, again, to follow or not follow whoever you want. We don't have really good discourse because there's just not a lot of places for it anymore. There aren't a lot of shows that are genuinely presenting multiple sides of an issue and giving them equal opportunity. Even the so-called shows on the cable news networks that have both sides represented, well, whoever's the marginalized side in that thing will always sort of like get 1 second to make a point and then get belittled by the other 4 people on the show.
Right. With the octabox of
yeah, exactly.
noise.
So poor Juan Williams on Fox, it's just like he makes a good point and then he gets shouted down by everybody else on that show that he's on. And then, it's the same thing in MSNBC. They've got some token conservatives that they bring in every once in a while, and they're never going to get a real opportunity to say what they want. I mean, the newspapers are the only place left to do it, and they're even compartmentalizing in ways that we weren't used to. So, I mean, it's just finding honest debate, honest space for debate is what's difficult. I think people want it, but I just think it's hard to find a place for it. Does that make any sense?
It does. I mean, and that's part of why we're trying to do some of the things we do. I mean, that's part of the magic of podcasting. But a little dirty secret is that I don't really watch much of that 24/7 news stuff because it's not really news. It's infotainment in a lot of ways to me. I'll pay attention if something big has happened or I need to pay attention, but I don't follow it because it just repeats over opinions and things and I'm not picking up new information.
See, I do watch that stuff and I switch back and forth between them because, for instance, the shooting in Uvalde, right? I wanted to see what the issues were on this because I'm very interested in finding some sort of a way to solve gun violence in this country. This is something I've been passionate about for many, many years. And I just want to know where the wiggle room is, there's potential space for compromise. So I watch what they're doing on MSNBC and they're get rid of assault weapons and all this kind of stuff. And Fox News, you go over there and they're talking about mental health care. Okay, great. Fund it. Then I'll believe you.
Right.
But at the same time, what are the things they're both talking about? They are both talking about whether or not an 18-year-old should be able to buy a weapon like this. So I'm like, wait, I'm hearing their commentators say, maybe we shouldn't allow that. Maybe that's the path forward for some sort of movement on this, is that I think we might get a deal on raising the age limit on when you can buy a weapon. And I think that's why I watch them, to see if there is that common ground somewhere, at least something that both sides are willing to talk about. And so it's important for me to know where both sides are coming from so I can, one, form an opinion, two, know what's going to motivate the person that's coming at it from a different angle from me. It helps calm people down when you are getting ready to talk to them if they're on a different side from you and they're just are nervous and they don't want to trust you. That, you're at least paying attention to what their arguments are. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but at least you're listening.
I think, too, that it's important to find that common ground, but how do you take action on that common ground? I think we both know, and I know gun owners who are like, hey, I would be fine with that.
Yeah.
I know them personally. And the issue is getting action to that. How do we move to that point? Because so much is kind of stuck right now.
I don't disagree, and it is stuck, and it's been stuck for a long time. We have not had any movement on gun issues, really, since the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban that we had, which in itself was a cowardly act when they put the sunset in. That was to appease gun people. Are like, well, we'll see if it works, and then we can decide whether or not we want to renew it. Well, it did work. To an extent, it reduced the number of shootings of these types of weapons. But again, that was a cowardly act to put that sunset in there because it's easy just to ignore it and let it go away. How do you push the action? I think we're seeing it. I mean, everybody's pissed off right now. Everybody's calling their congressperson. Everybody's calling their state reps. Everybody's calling their local elected officials about this kind of stuff. Between Black Lives Matter, between mass shootings, between violence in the streets in the cities, I think everybody's getting tired of it, and nobody can avoid the question anymore. You can't just hide behind the NRA, and you can't just hide behind the Second Amendment. There's got to be some nuance there, and I think we're going to see enough senators break off that we might see something done. Maybe an expansion of red flag laws. I'd love to see that. Florida did it. Florida, of all places. Rick Scott was the governor at the time. They passed that, didn't run afoul of the Constitution, and nobody's asking to repeal that in Florida.
I can't help but think this will be similar to when we added rules of the road to driving.
Yeah.
Right? There was a time there were no traffic lights. There was a time there were no lanes. There was a time there was no airbags, seatbelts, any of these things that we all take advantage, just assume are here today. And I feel like when it comes to the gun issue, that's going to be over time kind of the way we go.
The only difference, though, and this is something that the gun owners will point out, is that, cars are not written into the Constitution. But the government has been regulating them for a long time. Elon Musk is going to find that out pretty darn soon. I don't know if you saw the series that they just ran about the crashes and the, autopilot mode, which, by the way, whoever at his company signed off on calling something autopilot.
Oh, it's total marketing hype. I'm reading a book right now that's so good. I'm hoping to have the author on.
Yeah.
It's total hype.
It is. And I mean, it's cool technology, and I'm really looking forward to this technology being in cars. I would love nothing more than to drive to California and be able to watch movies and sleep the whole way. That would be fantastic instead of having to drive. But it's not there yet. And I'm surprised that NHTSA hasn't come down on him harder. But the thing is, firearms need that same sort of regulation, right?
Doesn't it say in the Constitution a well-regulated militia? Couldn't under a different Supreme Court or a different system, you could interpret that in a different way? You
could. I read a really interesting piece in the New York Times about that this morning. It was the Washington Post. A couple of former law clerks, one for Scalia, one for, who was it? But one liberal, and whoever wrote the two dissenting arguments on the Heller decision, talking about, there is room for this. Just because Heller said you have a right to a handgun doesn't mean that stuff's absolute. And Scalia, even in writing the majority opinion for that decision, said, doesn't mean you can walk around with machine guns. So the Supreme Court made it pretty clear that there is room to do this. And I think we'll get there. I'd like to see people have to have insurance if you own a gun.
Makes sense. You have to have it when you drive a car.
Exactly. And that's fine. You could potentially injure somebody there. You need coverage for this. Financial coverage in case somebody else gets injured in your accident or for damages to whatever. I think that should happen with handguns and with any guns, frankly. You have to buy an insurance policy because your gun could be responsible for somebody else dying. Because answer me this question, Jared, and forgive me for taking over here. But one of the things people always say is, well, if you take away guns, from law-abiding citizens, then only criminals will have guns. How did all those guns get into the wrong hands? Responsible gun owners selling them, giving them away, getting stolen. You don't lock them up in your car. All these guns started out legally. How many of them have become illegal and have been traded illegally because people are willing to skirt the rules and violate the law on these sorts of things?
Or one person's well-intended, but the other person isn't on a transaction, right?
Exactly. And I'm sorry, it seems to me that if you're going to be a quote-unquote responsible gun owner, you should have to have some insurance. Because what if your kid's over at another kid's house and they're playing and they find that kid's dad's gun and your kid gets shot when they're playing around? Not intentionally, it's an accident. Happens a lot.
Well, then also comes to the idea of responsibility. I know a number of gun owners. They are very serious about it. They're members of gun clubs.
Yeah.
They do the whole thing.
Most of my friends hunt and own multiple guns. And I've fired guns. I don't like them. I don't own one. But I understand why they do.
Mm-hmm. So I don't understand why there's so much pushback on a responsible gun ownership, plan where it's like, hey, if you're going to get a gun, you need to have these check marks off, at least the very basics of understanding, even a waiting period that they can actually check the records so that if somebody wants to do something bad and they go buy a gun. And right now the default in many places is where I think the default is that to give you the gun, if they don't get back in 2 days or 3 days, depending on what it is, if you change that to even 7 days or 10 days and give enough time to be oh, wait, you actually have a slew of convictions.
And why do you need it today? That's one of those questions I've always wanted to ask a gun shop owner. And the gun shop owner's somebody's I need a gun. Why? If you need it that bad, right now, someone trying to kill you? Are you trying to kill somebody else? Or do you really have an emergency hunting trip that you're going on tomorrow? I mean, chances are if somebody needs it that bad right away, they're either in trouble or they're going to get in trouble. A waiting period is a reasonable thing. Like I said, I still think you should be 21. I'm sorry, 18-year-olds walking into a gun shop. First of all, when I was 18 years old, I didn't have enough money to buy gas for my car, let alone semi-automatic weapon. It wasn't happening. Whatever happened to those good minimum wage jobs out there, right?
Now, for your base position on this, are you someone who works under the assumption that we're always going to have guns in this country?
Mm-hmm. And I don't like it. But that's just the way it is. I think the Heller decision did make that something that's going to be with us for a long time. At the same time, it doesn't mean we should be stupid about it. Free-for-all is a bad idea. It's been proven to be a bad idea. Somebody said the other day, this was pretty good. It said, hey, if I see my kid hitting another kid with a stick, yeah, he's going to get in trouble. But I'm also going to take the stick away. And somebody said, well, why don't you go after and find out what made them want to hit the kid with the stick in the first place? I said, also a valid argument. But how about both? Take the stick away and get the mental health treatment. Don't talk to me about mental health until you start funding it, because I'm tired of that.
Well, I know a lot of people in the mental health field that work with it, and they've had to leave it and go to other things. People are these are specialized skills to deal with mental health or to deal with some of even the more heavy issues, the ones where you're dealing with schizophrenia or all that other stuff. Those are even more specific skills. And yet those fields are losing people because they can't keep up because there isn't enough funding, and these people want to have kids or they want to have their own lives. It gets into a bigger question than that.
Yeah, but it also is a scapegoat, I think, for a lot of this stuff, because mass shootings are horrific, and we see them and they shock us to our core, and we weep, and then there's thoughts and prayers and all that stuff, and everything goes back to the way it was. But what we don't talk about all the time is how many people commit suicide with guns, how many, gun crimes we see in neighborhoods and around the country. There's just far too much of it. And we've fetishized weapons in a weird, bizarre way in this country. There's this fantasy that somehow we're all living in the Wild West, or we got to protect our families because, I don't know, how many enemies do you have, that you need to be armed to the teeth? The culture around it is somewhat dangerous, and it's out of balance. And just like anything else, it gets out of balance, you got to sort of rein it back in a little bit. And I think we're overdue for a correction there. And we will. And we're always going to be a violent country. We just are. Because we will never get rid of all the guns. And I'm not sure what you can do, but you can at least make it harder.
It's hard to fight culture, right? There's a large number of people who their culture and their life is built around the performative work around guns, or events that happen around guns, or going on shooting expeditions. It's part of just their daily life.
Totally agree. And, for the most part, those people are fine. Like I said, I've got friends who go to the range all the time. They love it. And then they do skeet shooting, and they got their fancy rifles everybody's looking at, these ARs and everything else. And they go to the range with it, and they love it, and it's fun for them. Fine. But they're also 50-something years old, and, they are doing target practice. They are doing these sorts of things. And, they do hunt and things like that. But, if I see a 17-year-old kid who's fantasizing about Call of Duty and reliving some of those fantasies or whatever, that's a little freaky. I think we are so desensitized to violence that people don't recognize, one, the power of weapons and what they can do. And I, for one, am all in favor of, let's see the pictures. Let's see the pictures so people can see the carnage. I think the victims' families, yeah, there's the initial shock. They may not want that. But at the same time, what about the rest of us? And what about the rest of us actually seeing what's really happening out there? I think it's important.
I think that was part of the issue too, though, with dealing with COVID.
Yeah.
Like, it was in these hospitals, all these other things. I would get stories and hear stories from friends of mine that are nurses and things like that. But that was never in the wider conversation of like what it was. There were so many people who could not compute what it was really like to them. It just wasn't connecting for them.
Numbers are hard to put into pictures.
Yeah.
And, so you hear like in the early days of COVID where we had 250, 300,000 Americans dying, now over 1 million. People are numb to that. They see that number and they're like, what's 1 million? I didn't know any of them. It didn't impact them personally in many instances. And then you talk to a family that was impacted by it. Or I've lost a few friends, obviously, to COVID.
Same.
That put it into a different perspective when you actually see a family grieving over something like that. Or when you see a family grieving over being the victim of gun violence, which we've unfortunately seen. That changes your perspective on it. But too many people are insulated from the actual impacts of these things, so they just don't want to see it. And that's wrong. I think we need to really sort of revisit it, because the cool factor for a lot of people on guns, for instance, I think we just need to tamp that down. It's not that cool. And the world is not so dangerous that you need to be armed to the teeth all the time. That's the other thing. What the hell are we so afraid of, Jer?
I wonder about that too myself sometimes.
I mean, we wander around in neighborhoods that some suburbanites would be like, oh, you can't go there. I just look at the stats and I look at the logic behind something. I just know this, that you are a lot more likely to die by a gunshot if you own a gun than if you don't, period. Just the numbers are infallible there. There's no way you can argue against this. You are much more likely to die by a gun if you have one than if you don't, because it's really hard to get killed when there's no guns around.
Before I let you go, we're at the Mackinac Policy Conference talking about the Detroit region in general, not just the city of Detroit. Are you more positive, less positive? What do you see ahead for the region, having sat in all the seats that you've sat? Like, how is your general feeling about it?
Obviously, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't have gone to work for the city and trying to, fix blight issues if I didn't think that there was a way forward there and that there was a future for neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. I mean, we did a lot of work there, and I'm proud of the work that we did there. And it wasn't without controversy, and it wasn't always easy. I mean, it was an incredibly difficult job. And it turned my hair gray really, really fast. But I loved it because I was out there talking to people in their neighborhood almost every single day, getting to know them, going to block club meetings, seeing the people who are diehards who are living here who care, and seeing how committed they were to improving just a little aspect of their life in their neighborhood. Getting that house torn down, or getting that other one renovated, or helping out an old lady who needed some assistance with some home repairs. Stuff like that was cool to do because you see people's good intentions on a daily basis. I'm somewhat bullish. Are there things to worry about? Yeah. I mean, what's going to happen with the future of automation? And the automotive industry is a big deal here, and we are being threatened with losing some of these things. But is manufacturing where we want to be on that, or do we want to be on the R&D side? And what do we do to solidify our place there? I think there's a lot of people making some pretty interesting decisions and starting to take some of our longer-term problems a little bit more seriously than we have in a long time. We're revisiting cutting budgets. We're starting to think about, how do we bring that up? How do we talk about equity in financing for things like education? How do we actually address infrastructure? We didn't want to talk infrastructure for 30 years, Jer. And it's like, we still have wooden sewer pipes under the ground in much of Metro Detroit.
I was just talking to Candace Miller about some of that stuff.
Well, she knows. I mean, remember her Fat Burger press conference?
I was there. I was there for it. Yep.
I was going to say that was fabulous.
She's good at that. She's good at that visual, direct, this is what's going on, a very pragmatic way of looking at
Well,
things.
and I like the way that she approaches her job. I really do. And I mean, she's a good administrator, and she's working hard at it, and she's bringing much needed attention to these problems, stuff we don't see. And I just get a feeling that now we are a little bit more serious about dealing with some of this stuff. We're recognizing that the way that we've done things for a long time doesn't work. Nothing trickles down. It just doesn't. And it's time to start thinking about not everything being equal, but things being equitable. That's a subtle change in language that I'm noticing ripple through just about every conversation I'm hearing up here and when I'm back home. That's a positive.
Craig Fahle, it's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure, Jer. Love it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you haven't already, follow us wherever you're listening to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening to shows. And of course, don't forget to tell a friend. It is the best way to push Metro Detroit's conversation forward. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Tomorrow, Fletcher Sharp joins me across the table to talk all things Detroit City FC and sports. And with that, remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.